Good morning. This is Brother Larry Cochran coming to you from Southampton Baptist Church again. I welcome our online Sunday school class. We're going to continue our study in what we've been calling God's transformational grace. This is our sixth study in the series, and this morning we're going to be coming out of Galatians chapter 5, verse 1 and verse 13. So let me read that verses to you, and then we'll begin our study. So in chapter 1, verse 5 of Galatians, it says, It is for freedom that Christ has set you free. Stand firm then. Do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. And in 13 it says, You, my brothers, were called to be free. Do not use your freedom to indulge in the sinful nature, rather than serve one another in love. This morning's study is going to be called to be free from what we call legalism. And we're going to get a little bit more on what we call legalism a bit later on. But first of all, let me introduce this from a historical concept, a kind of introduction this morning. You may not be familiar with what we call the Magna Charta. It was in 1215 an English barons forced King John to sign basically an agreement to protect personal civil rights at that particular time, to limit the authority of the king, to make sure the king was no longer what they might call above the law, and to protect them from illegal and being jailed illegally, and for what we call swift justice. Now, the reason I bring that up to you is that the whole background of that Magna Charta is part of what we understand as our Constitution today. Finds those same concepts in our Constitution. And so the reason I say that, because when you look at the book of Galatians has often been described by many people as the book that lays out our religious freedom. The Magna Carta, if you want to call that, of the Bible itself. It's that declaration of our freedom. It sets forth in Galatians our freedom to serve God, basically. It's not a freedom from God, but it's a freedom to serve God. In Galatians, Paul is speaking against what we call religious legalism, and one of the things that he found there that was so difficult, early in the New Testament church, especially if you were a convert from Judaism to Christianity, some Jews at that particular time who made that conversion often saw it as the need for other, especially Gentiles, to follow the law of Moses and to be circumcised. Paul writes this entire book of Galatians to refute that error in salvation. Paul says in many of his writings, and also in other portions of Galatians, salvation is by grace, and we don't need to add anything to that. And so Paul writes this whole book of Galatians to declare our freedom from the law itself. Now, I remind you, as I said in the last few weeks, the law itself, what we call the Ten Commandments, are there to give us a guideline, a direction, how we are to live. Jesus himself said, if you love me, you'll obey my commands. And we love others, we love ourselves. So how can we say that we love Christ and say we love others unless we know how we are to love them? And so if you look at the Ten Commandments, for example, it says, if you love me, you won't murder me. If you love me, you won't steal from me, for example. If you love me, you won't commit adultery with my wife or with my husband. So I've said for some time that these laws here in particular are the roadmap of how we are to live our Christian life, how we're to demonstrate that we love Jesus, how we're to love our fellow man. And so that's where I'm coming from this morning. So he writes this to correct it. So it's a freedom there from the law of Moses as a way to gain God's favor, as a way to gain God's, for example, salvation. It kind of came down to the fact that, so what Paul is addressing here is this wrong view that salvation is Jesus Christ plus something else. Anytime we find that a person says salvation is Jesus plus something else, that's an error. It's also legalism. Here Paul is addressing this thing. It says that salvation was Jesus Christ plus keeping certain religious laws, the laws of Moses, and certain traditions. And what he writes against most clearly here is what we would call the custom of circumcision. And that played a very important role in the life of the nation of Israel, because that was the covenant sign that God made with Abraham way back in the Old Testament, the book of Genesis. said, the covenant I will have with you, Abraham, the sign of that covenant will be circumcision, and all of your children, I believe on the 8th day, they are to be circumcised. And so the Jews that came along later became Christians said that you need to continue this particular practice, especially the one of circumcision. So Paul writes this to refute that. Now, I pique you again, like in Galatians 5:1, he says, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. But the yoke of slavery is referring to is slavery to the law as a way of gaining God's blessing, a way of gaining God's favor. Because the Scripture says, by keeping the law will no man be justified. So Paul is not saying we shouldn't obey the law. He's saying we shouldn't follow the law as a way to gain God's favor or the way to gain God's salvation added to Jesus Christ. It is a roadmap, the way we are to follow, as I pointed out earlier, how we are to live, how we show that we love God, how we show we love the Lord himself. So I want to make that very clear to you this morning. And so we look at this particular brand of legalism here in the New Testament of circumcision. Now, quite clearly, we have moved beyond that in the church of our day and time today. We don't follow that kind of tradition, nor should we. And we don't require it for salvation. We think of grace and grace alone in Jesus Christ. What we have done instead is we have developed another brand of legalism has come along. And we've come up with certain kinds of man-made rules that says this is how we gain God's favor. This is how you're more committed to God. I'm more committed than you are because I follow these rules. Things of that sort. And so that's where we come into play this day. So we have to live this Christian life based off living by grace, living by the faith in Jesus Christ. Now, the writer here calls this evangelistic legalism, kind of a paradox of words already. I'll state that to you. But it's a form of legalism. I'm going to read what he says here. Legalism is, first of all, anything we do or don't do in order to earn favor with God. It's concerned with rewards to be gained or penalties to be avoided. This is legalism we force on ourselves. Second, legalism is conforming to a man-made religious rules and requirements, which often are unspoken but are nevertheless very real. To use a more common expression, it requires conforming to the do's and the don'ts of a particular Christian circle. Now, it's wrong when we force this legalism on ourselves or on others. To say this is how I can say I'm a better Christian than you, I'm more committed than you are, and you're not. You're not following these particular set of rules I've laid down I've laid down or our denominations laid down. And because you don't do that, you're not as good a Christian as I am, for example, where that might lead to. So we force on others. Now for a second, let's look at how pervasive this was even in the New Testament days. And so we can look at the Pharisees. Now, Pharisees were a group of individuals who studied the Old Testament profusely and made numerous what we call fence laws to kind of protect them from breaking the commandments himself. Paul himself, who refers to himself as a Pharisee, and it's rules they made to kind of help God. Let's put it like that, to help God in the sense of adding these man-made rules to make sure that they didn't get even close to breaking the commandments of God. So they built these kind of these rules like fences. And in Mark 7:6-8, Jesus says this about the Pharisees, about their commands. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain, but their teachings are but rules taught by men. You have let go of commandments of God and are holding on to traditions of men. Now, here's what I know about this. There were over the Pharisees, and this is a span of time, even before the time of the Pharisees, but as the years went along, especially the period of time by the time Christ was alive, they had built over 1,500 additional rules, what we might call offenses, kind of protecting from crossing into breaking the commandments of God. And some of them were quite silly rules. For example, I want to share one with you now. On the Sabbath day, you were not allowed to swat a fly because you might be guilty of hunting if you did. On the Sabbath day, a woman was not allowed to look in a mirror because she might see a gray hair and she might pluck it out and she'd be guilty of working on the Sabbath. On the Sabbath day, you weren't to carry anything that weighed more than a dried fig, more than a half a mile. You see how silly some of these rules were, but by the time Christ came along, these rules carried the same weight in the mind of the Pharisees. They pushed them on the people as the original Ten Commandments did. And so the Pharisee looked out across the culture, the people. So if you don't obey these rules, then you're the same as breaking the Ten Commandments of God. And they kind of made themselves more proud of the fact that they did, and looked down on those individuals who didn't. And that's the danger of legalism itself. Get that a little bit later on. And so when we talk here about Christian legalism, it might seem quite severe to say that about Christians, but it's quite true today. There are far too many instances where man-made rules have come into play and seem to carry the same weight as some of the things in the Bible. A few examples, for example, sometimes it gets down to the length of dress that a woman can wear or shouldn't wear, or how she wears her hair, or should she wear jewelry or not wear jewelry, wear makeup or not wear makeup, for example. It gets down to did a person drink alcohol or doesn't drink alcohol? They dance or don't dance, for example. And some of them, and I know of some particular denominations that their man-made rule is they are not involved in mission work, or even so don't believe in mission work in a sense of because they just think God can do it on His own, doesn't need man be involved in it. But anyway, that's a few examples of that. They get so concerned about that person, what they think is abusing the freedom they have in Jesus Christ, and then they get more concerned about guarding that and concerned about the freedom to make sure they don't, mess up some way and do something God doesn't want them to do. So legalism does in itself indulges a sinful nature. Here's how that happens. You get too far into legalism, we find it there in the Pharisees. You find today among some believers who might press the legalistic term. For example, the writer says it fosters self-righteousness and religious pride. Now, both of those things are affront to God. We have no self-righteousness, and we're told to be humble. But those two things can do that. I can say, I can pop my suspenders. I live a more committed life than you because I follow this ABC rules and you don't. Or I do this and you don't. And so we get this religious pride going on, and we get this self-righteousness going on. So really what it does diverts from real issues of living the Christian life by focusing on these external, sometimes even silly, foolish rules that we just talked about. Sometimes a lot like the rules that Jesus encountered and the Pharisees. Now let's look at the moral offenses. Let's jump there for just a second. So legalism, man-made rules come back, all the way back at least to the New Testament. We find it there in the Pharisees, I talked about already. 1500 they came up with to protect the Ten Commandments of God and other laws of Moses. And a writer, William L. Cohen, has written a book called The Pharisees' Guide to Total Holiness. And here's what he says in the book. The Pharisees are desperately determined not to break the laws of God. Consequently, they devise a system to keep them from coming even closer to angering God. They contrived offensive Pharisaic rules that would guarantee a safe distance between himself and the laws of God. The fence or hedge laws accumulated, it says hundreds, but I know it's exactly 1,500, over the years were passed around orally. Soon it became apparent that they were far from optional. The laws became every inch as important as the scriptural laws, and some instances even far more important. Now we still practice we're still trying to practice a little bit of this fence building today. And sometimes the fences are good, and sometimes they're not. It depends. If we apply a fence, it's for ourselves. We don't impose it on somebody else, or think it's going to judge how well they committed to serve the Lord or not serve it. It may be a fence that we need. But if we push it on someone else and say that they need it because God showed it to us, and because God showed us, they should observe the same fence that we have. There's where the wrong part comes in. And so these fences again are designed to keep us from breaking, even getting close to breaking the rules of God. Now, the writer has a beautiful story I'm going to quickly summarize for you. He talks about when his children were younger, maybe in the early teens, his sons, his daughters, and they would go to a beach, kind of like here in Alabama, we go to Gulf Shores or go to Panama City. He talks about how they used to enjoy going to the beach, and he went just once a year, maybe twice a year. He said, and he gave an example of one time they went when the children were younger. He went to the beach and said it wasn't just very, very, very short time. He began to notice what he called scantily clothed young ladies walking up and down the beach and in the water. He said he finally grew tired of averting his eyes. Not wanting to be tempted to have a lustful thought about these young ladies, and eventually told his wife and children he'd go back to his room and wait there. Now that's a fence that he built. That was a fence that he recognized. He stayed there long enough, he'd be tempted to have a lustful thought, and to avoid that and to get away from that, he said he went back to his room and got off the beach. The point he's making is this: what if he came to the conclusion that all beaches were sinful because of that, and tried to impose that upon someone else, or told his teenage son it's simple to go to the beach, but didn't tell him why, and didn't explain to him that you can have just lustful thoughts, say at your school, where you're going to school or someplace else, but tried to impose that upon his son and someone else. And he said he didn't do that for his son, but what if he had? And so they said that really is a neglect of the real issue, which is lusting and you shouldn't lust, and building the fence and forcing on someone else is wrong, what point he makes out. Now here goes on and says, I quote again, for all of us, it may be good to have some fences, but we have to work on keeping them as just that, our fences. Helpful to us, but not necessarily as powerful to anyone else. We also have to work guarding our freedom from other people's fences. That's the point we're talking about. We're talking about freedom from legalism and freedom to serve. Now it goes on to talk about what we call options, defining options. And Paul addresses this also in his writing. So it says a secondary legalism arises from believers holding different opinions about certain practices. As I pointed out, maybe some believe you shouldn't dance. Some think it's okay. Some believe you can't wear maybe a certain type of clothing. Some Christian organizations say women should wear trousers, for example, at some point. And some women do. Some shouldn't wear jewelry and some do. And on goes that whole process there. And so so he talks about how that type of fence. Matter of fact, Paul says, the writer says he devoted an entire chapter of Romans to this brand of legalism. Romans 14:1, Paul says this, disputable matters, he calls it. We would call them differing opinions today. Now, let me read this to you. So the crux of the problem is stated well by Paul in verse 5 of Romans 14. One man considers one day more sacred than another. Another man considers every day alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. Since people simply have different opinions about various issues, one person sees no problem in a certain practice, another person considers that practice to be sinful. And see, more often these kind of opinions, these kind of practices arise from a family culture or geographical area or even a church culture. They arise that way and often have no basis in biblical sense whatsoever, the things themselves. And so he goes on to say this, as Christians we can't seem to accept the clear biblical teaching in Romans 14 that God allows equally godly people to have different opinions on certain matters. We universalize what we think is God's particular leading in our lives and apply it to everyone else. We're insisting that he must be sure to have led everyone as we believe he has led us. We refuse to allow God the freedom to deal with as individuals when we think like that, and we are legalism. Let's talk about what we call the do's and don'ts. I referenced this a little bit earlier. And so we're going to call the do's, the Christian do's, the spiritual disciplines, and the don'ts we're going to call the offenses, for example. So, what are some of the do's of spiritual disciplines that we should be doing, and everyone should be doing, for example? And that's like have regular private devotions and prayer time, a Bible study. Now, if I take that legalism and says because you don't, then you're less a Christian than I am, less committed than I am, that's legalism. That's how that works. So you can turn the do's into legalism also. Memorizing Scripture. Meet with a group of Bible and a group Bible study, like on Wednesday night or a group together, whatever it might attend in church on a regular basis. Attend a weekly prayer meeting. Now, the writer says here he's not downplaying any of those kind of disciplines at all. He says they're benefits. and the benefits we ought to take advantage of, we ought to practice and provide for our good. But these are privileges we ought to practice and not duties we ought to perform. And so we think in terms of duties and think other people should do that, we might reach the conclusion, get that self-righteousness going on that we talked about, and they're less committed than we are, get prideful about it. It gives a word of caution so we can become just as legalistic about our do's as we can about our don'ts. And how that happened, it gives us two ways the writer does. It can easily become a performance measurement by which we gauge whether to accept God's blessing or not. And secondly, when we get even more legalistic about spiritual disciplines with others, we try to subtly get them to follow our own pattern, communicate in some form or fashion with them, and they don't practice those same kind of things that we do. They seem to be less committed. So we should promote these practices. I'm not just saying we shouldn't, but we shouldn't say that you have to do this to be like a Class A Christian, to be as good as I am, or somehow live up to some rule that makes you more committed and more in favor of God. What legalism often does, and that's the danger involved here, that we look at that term legalism, so that's how we get more favorism from God, how God will bless us more, or how God will punish us if we don't follow these rules. And I pointed out on several lessons so far, God loves us just as much as He's ever going to love us, whether we obey Him or don't obey Him. The problem comes into fellowship. We might not feel as close to Him as we ought to feel, but He still loves us just as much as He always did and always will love us. And so we get into the last little part here when it comes to these kind of things, because this is where it really comes down to. Christians are called to live for God and not the approval of others. That's the problem. We aren't careful. We begin to forget about living for God and begin to live to have the approval of others. Why? Because we're afraid they might gossip. We're afraid they might judge us. They might bring some kind of negative comment about us. And so we have to realize we need to stand firm in that freedom, the freedom to be all that God would want us to be. Freedom to live by grace and not by legalism, as we talked about here, and not live in the fear of what other people think. And so Paul also addresses this in Galatians chapter 1, verse 10. Paul said, am I now trying to win the approval of men or of God? If I'm trying to please men, if I were trying to please men, I would not be a servant of Christ. And there's the real truth. When you try to please men, you're not a servant of Christ. If we're going to be a servant of Christ, it must be in a position where we're pleasing Him and not men. Now, sometimes the two will come together. I got that. But oftentimes, if this legalism causes us to have to choose one or the other. Do I please this individual by surrendering to their command or their statement I should be like they are? Or do I look and see that's not a biblical basis and please Christ instead? We should always lean toward pleasing Christ instead. Because if we're going to have a joy in our freedom in Christ, we have to decide right now, every day, will I please God or will I please men? That's what it really comes down to. Because here's the ultimate truth of all. I'm ultimately not responsible to anybody who may say you need to live this way or act this way or behave this way because that's the way I think God says we all should do that. What it really comes down to this. We are all responsible to God and not to people. And that's the whole basis of what Paul has to say in Galatians, the whole basis of today's Bible study. And I pray that you will take this truth into heart and begin to exercise the freedom you have in Jesus Christ, freedom to live for Him and not live by legalism, and understand that you're not going to gain God's favor or not, by trying to live in a legalistic way. I remind you again, we should obey, for example, the Ten Commandments, but we obey it out of love, not out of a sense that we can get God's greater blessing. God will punish us if we don't, but because we love God, that's how we show we love God. We love Jesus Christ. You have a God-blessed day, and we'll see you next Sunday morning.